Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Federica Bressan, a podcaster, writer, former researcher, and Renaissance woman. In this episode, I ask how can we communicate scientific ideas better? How can we determine what is true and what is false? How does technology shape what it means to be human? And so much more. I loved this conversation with Federica, and I wish it could have gone on for longer. Sadly, we did have some technical difficulties in getting it set up and getting it recorded. So many things went wrong, but it was good. I ended up fixing most of these things in post and editing, but there were definitely a small few parts that I couldn't fix. Please put up with it, just listen to it, enjoy it. It's great. Also, I will say that English isn't Federica's first language. Even so, she does an amazing job answering my questions and expressing her thoughts and ideas. With all that said, if you want more expert interviews like this, make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on those episodes. I believe that about covers it. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Federica Bressan. Federica, it's a pleasure to have you on tonight. It's been a nightmare getting technology to work halfway around the world, but I'm happy that you're able to join me, so thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, before we really dive into technology and communication and all this stuff, could you tell me a bit about who you are and what is it that you do, or your background?
Right. So, my name is Federica Bressan. I am 43 years old. And in the past roughly 20 years, I've had two main careers. The first one was musician, so doesn't matter much at this point. The main one was then an academic researcher. In the past about 12 years, I've worked as that. I have a PhD in computer science, but a passion for music and a couple degrees there too. So I have always worked with technology and the arts, with computer science and music. And during my last years as a researcher, I started in parallel this other thing with podcasting and science communication, which is not, science communication is a broad field. So I just want to qualify myself. I started a podcast that was very close to my research interests, but it was interview based. So I was learning too. I always had guests on, pretty much like you do. So it was not science communication as you see, very educational. Like there's someone who explains something to you, almost like a lesson. So this is the type of science popularization that I've been involved with. And when my career in research stopped very much due to COVID in 2020, we can talk about that if you want, how it happened and all, but that's when it stopped. The podcasting went on. Then I wrote a novel in the past years, so I don't know exactly who I am anymore because it's so easy to coincide with your job. You say, I am this. I am a researcher. Right now, I do different things, but among these, there's still podcasting. I am a speaker, and I'm an author, and I'm a guest on podcasts just like yours.
Yeah, I totally understand that. It's so hard to sometimes figure out how do I introduce myself when I can't really encompass all of that cleanly into one word of I'm a researcher, I'm a podcaster, I'm an author. For me personally, it's balancing between I'm an inventor, I'm a podcaster, I'm a woodworker, I make musical instruments, I do metalworking, I do all this stuff. It's like, how do I quickly share that information with another person so that they understand who I am?
Not very much. Actually, introduce yourself is a super hard question. As long as I was a researcher, even if I was also a podcaster and other things, it was still easier. And that's something people understand. Oh, I do research. I published a novel, for example, but I really resist calling myself an author. I just said it because I see that it's common to do. And other people who published books, they call themselves authors. But I resist because to me, if you say I am an author, kind of means that you make a living off of your writing. I just published a book. That's a different thing. Sometimes when I do book talks and I still, promote my book, they introduce me like the writer. or the author. Now, I'm fine if I'm the author of that book, but I'm not an author. I'm just someone who published one book, and I did with a publisher, not self-publishing, which is so popular now that it's accepted and maybe your work is great. I still pride myself in having found like a publisher because I submitted my manuscript and they deemed it good enough for publication and all of that process happened. So I like to feel that I have those credentials, but still, so it's so hard. So hard. And it's also so boring for the listeners to say, oh, she does this and she does that. Oh, but it's so hard to say what she does. Well, get to know me. I have quite a presence online. Just Google my name. I have a separate website for all the things I do.
Indeed,
I still have
do.
My research.
I enjoyed going through all of your websites to prepare for this. I enjoyed reading your research. I loved some of the one of the papers I went through about recording tapes backwards to see if we can get like a good, if we could still preserve quality through recording them backwards and then reversing that audio information. Loved reading through that, and a couple other papers in there. Awesome research that you've done, really. It fascinates me.
I'm so happy to hear that. That was so cool. And that was part, I'm happy to say, that was good work. And I'm not just saying quality research because I did it. That was engaging, interesting work, teamwork, because everything in research is teamwork. So it's not just my work. And it was exciting, but it was towards the end of my career, which I just said stopped due to COVID. But how to make this short, because I believe that academia is a whole ecosystem and that many people don't know how it works from the inside. I can make this short. I hope it will be understandable. Nowadays, research is mostly funded for projects, and projects last for years. And there is a desire from funders, funding bodies, to give you money to do the best work and most work, meaning that what you promise in the application needs to be groundbreaking research, revolutionary. I will find cure for cancer or big things. And actually, I strongly believe, and the colleagues that I respect the most, they all know how science actually works, and that is baby step, progressive advancements. That means small work and constant and incremental, and sometimes you stumble into a big break, a big thing, but it's baby steps. And to kind of make this without the whole explanation, I was lucky enough in my last years at university to have the freedom to actually do the work I wanted. And that's where those good articles came from. That was good work, but just the paper, like reading tapes backwards, etc., which would require context probably, that is a baby thing, and yet a very interesting question that would require an answer in the field of audio preservation. But that was not part on any funded project. And I got many of those articles, and I'm proud because me and not my team, I wasn't the leader of the team. My colleagues at several universities, we had the freedom, privilege in part, to actually study what we wanted. And I'm proud of that work.
Yeah. Some of the best work from what I've seen is always the work that comes from when someone's actually curious about the thing. They're not busy looking off of the mountain of, I'm going to cure cancer, when they don't even know the next 3 steps in front of them. Whereas reading tapes backwards, because audio preservation is important, and be able to preserve these historical documents or these historical recordings, might be able to read them backwards and might preserve the tapes to make them more readable, or to be able to hold on to them a bit longer, or perhaps limit the damage to them. I'm not going to dive too deep into your research, but what I really want to dig out of that is that it's this research that when we can really follow our curiosity, like our natural curiosity, and not just go where the money is, then we can find some super fascinating, interesting things.
I totally agree. Probably the tape thing is easily explained because it's not even rocket science. I was working in audio preservation, mostly with magnetic tapes for historical audio recordings that need to be digitized, needs to be taken off the tape, and nowadays put in a computer in a digital format for long-term preservation. And the tapes degrade over time. They're very brittle, fragile, and some of those in poor shape will not stand multiple reads on the machine. And some of those tapes are recorded, well, say different formats, different configuration of the tracks, but they may be in both directions. Like, I don't know if younger people are familiar with the old tape cassettes, but
I grew up
anyone
I
above
grew
a
up with
certain
that
age,
stuff. I was probably the last generation where like you were familiar with them. I grew up raised on all that stuff.
thank you, because CDs wouldn't teach you that. They don't have, two sides, and a vinyl record has two sides, but it's a different thing. So a tape on the same length of the tape may have tracks recorded in both directions so that you have to flip the tape to read it on the other side. This is the same with the open reel tapes. So a different object, but when you read it in one direction, if you could pick up the other track too, that would mean that you're listening one track forward and the other track backwards, so you don't understand what's being said or played, but you can still pick up that audio, put it in your computer, and then reverse the track so that you understand what's in that track, but you only read the tape once. You save time, and you possibly save the tape's life if it didn't, 'cause every time you read a tape, like a vinyl record, the physical carriers, they degrade. And so working in audio preservation where quantity is a problem, it's a thing for large archives that need to actually even reading tapes at a higher speed is a thing, again, to save up time in this case. So we wondered, would it be legit to pick up both tracks in two different directions and then reverse one in the computer in a preservation project that wants to meet certain standards and criteria for archival preservation, to call that a document. And that was what the experiment was about. So indeed, we used certain tapes that would not disintegrate if read multiple times. And we digitized them a couple of times, in two goes or in one go, picking up both tracks, and then compared the resulting audio in a digital form. And then there's some statistics there because you wouldn't get the same track bit by bit, because the analog machine, every time you read something, will be different, has a certain tolerance. So we selected audio features to compare, and we did that. And according to that experiment, it would be legit to pick up the two tracks in both sides.
Mm-hmm. Utterly fascinating. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so let's dive into the meat and potatoes of why I really wanted to bring you on. I want to talk a bit more about how can we be better at communicating scientific ideas to people, or trying to really share these findings that we might have. I'm someone who loves reading research papers and loves trying to share the things that I learned from podcasts or from these papers with other people, but it can be sometimes so difficult to try to really share these ideas. So how can we get better at communicating complex ideas to people? For example, food science or COVID and like the research behind these things. I know this is something I personally want to get better at because, like I said, love reading articles, but actually talking about them with people who haven't read the same articles and who haven't been able to figure that out as well, it can be so difficult. Where might we want to start with that?
That is a very complicated question. And that is, first of all, I don't know many people who are not in research that read research papers. It's a literature on its own. And when I started out in academia, I had to learn how to write those. I mean, it's almost like a literary genre, if you want.
Yes.
And every single study, in the best case scenario, because there's much wrong also in the publishing system in academia, but in theory, best case scenario, each paper would represent that baby step that I was talking about earlier on. So that one paper never describes like the big discovery or the whole thing. It should be something that's self-contained in that it makes sense, has a beginning and an end. But if you just read that, I would imagine that as a layperson or even a researcher from another field, you still need the broader picture. It's like a small tile in a mosaic. You need to make sense of that in a broader picture. So the best way to learn about that, if you could, would be to actually speak to those researchers who did the research, because they would not just explain the content of the research to you, which is mostly what the paper is about, but give you a narrative, which is the broader picture in human understandable terms. Why we do this, where this is going, and what this paper that you read about is part of, what question we are trying to answer. That's the big thing. What is the question? Always. And about communicating science to the broader audience, they really, I want to say you catch me off guard, but just because when I am asked that question, or when just the topic is raised, I'm always that person that sounds pessimistic, or I take the question apart instead of giving an answer. So I guess I'm very frustrating to the audience or to the person who asks me the question. But I just wonder, the audience who? And does the audience, when we talk about the generic audience, the layperson, the men in the street, still, who are we talking about? Because since leaving academia, I've been hanging out with a bunch of more people who are not in academia. As long as I was in academia, most of my friends just were limited to research. And now I have these other people I hang out with, and I can promise you they're not interested. And not because who cares about science, it's that everybody has their lives, they have worries, they whatever, So when we talk about communicating science to them, of course, like if someone found a cure for cancer, or when we shoot another, rocket into space, maybe that's newsworthy. It should be on TV also, like the piece of news. But that is covered already. That's in the evening news. And there's not much to understand about it unless you want to go into the detail. Then you have to call up the researcher and set up an interview or something. But there's research carried out every day. Every PhD student, every postdoc, every professor is working on something. And I don't want to diminish that by saying it's not newsworthy, but it's so small and there's so much of it that, are we talking about that science when we talk about communicating it to the audience, or just the big things? So we have the Neil deGrasse Tysons on television, great communicators that are currently not actively doing research, or like he's not a postdoc. He's not talking about his postdoc research. When he goes on TV shows, and he's great, he normally talks about the solar eclipse that happens on that day, or what's wrong with sci-fi movies. Is that science communication? Well, yeah, and it's very engaging. People like that. But that's not the research that one postdoc is doing in that university, in that state. That never gets talked about for the most part. So I'll finish here, but actually, if you want to explain better what you think you mean when you talk about communicating science to the audience.
I think you raised a number of great points there, such as, just had a pain stick through my shoulder out, but you make a great point there of the audience that you're trying to communicate to. That matters so much. Who are you trying to talk to? What's the audience? What's the message you want to get across? And how important, how relevant is it to them? The person who goes and watches the evening news and sees, oh, a rocket launched today, and it's like, okay, that's cool, but they don't have the context behind maybe why it might be important to them, but they might not care. Or the average farmer might not care about recording tapes backwards because that's just not part of their life. And for some reason, even though I try to dig into this idea of identifying your audience and trying to cater your message to your audience, for some reason that never even crossed my mind when it came to trying to share scientific findings with people, because I find most sciencey things inherently interesting, no matter how niche or how deeply boring people might find it. For example, tomorrow I'm hopping on a phone call with a friend and talking about exophiles that live in the like volcanic depths of Iceland for who knows how long because it seems like fun. Like most people don't care about that. And now I have to sit back and think, well, should people care about this? Like should more like is there a reason that people need to be caring more about like different things going on in the realms of science and advancement and technology when all they really care about is what's going on with the newest gossip in the world. What are celebrities up to? And you mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson, how he's able to bring people into this world of science through Cosmos and through being a great communicator, but mostly through entertainment. And that's another lens that I never really thought about as well of we don't just have to share this information with people. If we want people to listen to us, we have to get them to be interested in it. We have to get them to see there's fun in this. It's exciting, and we just have to try to really evolve from that. So all that, like, keeping all that in mind, I guess perhaps we should just table that conversation for a second. Actually, no. I remember as I was researching you and some of what you've talked about a bit with technoculture, you talked a bit about how the U.S. responded to COVID and how different people tried to communicate some of the ideas that, like some of the things we were learning about COVID. Could you dig a bit more into that, about how that worked, how maybe some things went well, how some things went wrong? Would you mind digging into that a little bit?
Hmm. Well, communicating science is hard enough, but during COVID, indeed, I got interested both in COVID and in what it means to communicate science in a time of crisis. That's the point. Because as you said for yourself, you're curiosity driven. You just find this stuff fun. But when that information, that scientific information, is going to affect you in the now, because there's a pandemic going on, you listen differently. It's not just edutainment. It's not just for fun, because you can listen. Now, I don't want to, go back to him all the time, Neil deGrasse Tyson. You can listen to him talk about the stars for hours because it's fascinating. But I don't think that you're very concerned with truly understanding or retaining that information to use it later. You're not going to use it later.
I probably won't have to worry about how black holes are affecting me on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. You can live without knowing they are out there at all. Well, we have for quite a long time. But during COVID, when people were explained by alleged experts on TV and the internet how vaccines work, how viruses spread, people were not just listening because it's fascinating. People were listening to understand because they thought, oh, I may learn something that changes the way I walk in the street then today, and I know what distance to keep from other people, how to breathe, what to do, what symptoms to look for. And so, like I said, if communicating science is difficult enough, you're asking me a question of communicating science in a time of crisis, which makes it even harder. And, oh God, I'm so difficult. Gosh, I wish I had, the politically correct answers, but
I don't care about politically correct stuff. Say whatever comes to mind.
I think that I really put my finger where it hurts if I tell you that there was no amount of scientific explanations that we could give people during COVID that would make the management of the pandemic go better. Because in order to get vaccinated or not, what I truly need is trust in the institutions, trust in the system, way, way more than I need to me personally as an individual understand how the vaccine works, because I'm not going to check it personally anyway. So there is a link somewhere between transparency and understanding and trust. But you can explain to me as a layperson how a vaccine works all you want. But if I begin from a place of resistance, of not trust, or even conspiracy theory, you're not going to convince me with the explanation of how it works. We need to work on trust in the institutions of science, or even, government and the healthcare professionals, which is not something it's not an intellectual conversation. You can explain something to someone, and by the end of that conversation, if you're a good scientist, if you're a good talker, you will have convinced, because it's not about convincing. You see, first of all, when you listen to science stuff, it's because it's fun. You don't have to be convinced. You listen because it's fun, and you sort of tend to believe it, because when you listen to, shark documentaries and everything they say, you're not doubting. When we used to listen to how vaccines work, etc., many people started from a position of not trusting. So were they even listening? That's complicated. I guess you got my point. So what went wrong during COVID was not the quality of the explanations. I believe that there were too many explanations, because those things are so complex that unless you have a background in microbiology or, medicine, you really don't have the tools to fully understand what they're explaining to you, more or less qualitatively, broad strokes, which may be, again, interesting if you're a curious person. But I know for me, when I was listening to those explanations being given daily, clearly with the hope that they would call more people to get vaccinated, to reassure that it's safe, because this is how the tests work, that was a complete failure. And the more they try to explain, the more noise they created, actually. So this is what went wrong. But this is something that you need to cultivate in times of peace, in the long term. So when the crisis hits, you're kind of ready. If when the crisis hits, you find that the population doesn't have much trust in the institutions of science and the government, etc., there's not much you can do.
Absolutely. You touched on a number of interesting topics there that I've actually talked about in various other episodes I recorded, like even a couple days before on this, such as human beings make decisions based on emotion, not based on logic. We make emotion-based decisions and then back them up with logic. So it doesn't matter how many times someone will explain, this is how the vaccine works, this is how all vaccines work, or this is how things work. Because if you inherently don't trust the thing that's telling you what to do, or the thing that's like telling you this is what we should do to help us out as a whole, like you aren't going to convince them. It's exactly as you said. And I guess for some reason none of this just ever clicked for me, but as you're saying it now, I'm realizing, oh, that makes so much sense. Of people can explain whatever scientific concepts they like in times of peace or in times of conflict, but if you aren't trusting of the person, or if you aren't trusting of whatever entity it is, it doesn't matter how good of a job they do at explaining whatever concept they're trying to explain. You're inherently going to be standoffish, inherently going to say, I don't trust you, I'm not going to listen to whatever you say. So absolutely, building up goodwill in times of peace, in times when lower stakes, when there are lower stakes. It's amazing how just a little bit of tending the garden before things go bad can help out in the long run. So, with all this said about building trust and communicating science in a better way, an idea popped into my head. Of a few months back, I started hearing a lot about allegations across many major universities, where there are various professors who are showing that their information was falsified, or they had fake information, fake research that they were publishing out there, claiming as true and real. And with everything that we've talked about, how we need to build trust with people in order, if we want to actually share ideas or convince them that what we're teaching them actually matters, how can we start to figure out what is true, what is good or truth in the world, if we don't have this, I guess foundation of trust? Since I've heard this from many people, that if you want to find a paper that proves any belief you want, you can find it online. There are many papers that you can find that will support whatever side or whatever belief you want. So how can we go about trying to find more empirical, objective truth in what we research?
Wow, I love your question, because normally the obvious question would be, how do we make people to trust science, right? So try to lay out a couple of concepts, one after the other. Let me see if I can be clear. Stuff that I believe is really worth putting out there. The first one is, Ideally, I would never hear the phrase, I don't trust science anymore in my life, because what you don't trust are the people who make the science or the institutions of science, because not trusting science is just a stupid statement. It's like not trusting math.
I don't trust
right?
physics anymore. I don't believe gravity applies to me.
Exactly. So that if we chose our language correctly, then we would be a step ahead, because we would consciously show that we understand the difference between not trusting science versus not trusting people. People who make the science, or that one study. Do you trust any study funded by McDonald's or Coca-Cola, for example? To demonize the major companies, always the same ones. Do you trust that at all? Now, it's true what you said, that you can basically find a paper to support, everything and the contrary of everything. Or how to even, knowing that there's falsified, fake, plagiarized, massaged research published out there would contribute to destroying trust in science, even from those who have it. Or again, I said trust in science for brevity. Even in those who have it. Well, let me think what I want to say next so that I make sense. Most things I know on trust in science come from the discussions that I have had with a historian of science, Maarten van Dijk. I always, when I talk about these things, refer the audience to the interviews, and mainly the one I have on my podcast, Technoculture, which is called Trust in Science, because there he talks, and I don't want to take credit for his good ideas. I just want to take responsibility if I misquote him. I try to report his words. He said that there is trust within science, and then there's trust from the outside of science in. That would be the public trust in science, but also scientists trust each other, because even among the scientific community, it's kind of taken for granted that if you publish that study, it was peer-reviewed, it was checked, so I don't have to worry to go and check again. I trust it. So actually there is trust between peers in science. And that trust is foundational, is necessary, because there is no time nor the possibility to go and check what everybody else does. And this is a crucial point, because in the rhetoric about science, a positive rhetoric about science, even in those who support science and want to support science, they say that you can trust science because it's evidence-based. I can show you. You don't have to believe me. I have evidence. And I love this, because this is a huge, trap, a misunderstanding that I begin my interview with Maarten with. I tell him, look, why do we even talk about trust in science? Because science is all about evidence. Why would I need trust if I can show to you, if I can prove to you, have evidence? I don't know that you do. And whatever you show me, either I just replicate your study to check for myself, or I will never know. I will have to trust you, my colleague. He says rarely scientists go to the lab of their colleagues and look over their shoulder to see what they're doing. And I'll tell you more. At this point in time, there's so much knowledge that we built on previous knowledge that even if I went out and checked what you did last month and published in your paper, there's no way I could check all the rest that came before that. It's like a chain going back, to the beginning of time. And you see in the light of what I have said that the problem of trust is very complex, and it really lies someplace else other than evidence per se, and other than the method of science. In fact, and I don't want to move away from your question too much, but this was a very important point to add to this conversation, I believe.
Go for it.
Speaking of convincing people by explaining things, which is still in the mainstream media and like popular beliefs, the way to go. Every time you try to engage an anti-vaxxer, a flat earther, where you go is the explanation, And if you don't want to listen to me, take it from this expert. So the more authoritative the source is, the dumber you are if you don't believe it. But it's still an explanation that should convince you. And if you pay close attention, what you're having with those types of people, the non-believers, etc., is very much not a rational conversation. And they are entitled to their disbelief. Because speaking of vaccines, rather than flat earthers, because it's a different thing, vaccines, because we've been through it recently, as far as I know, I don't know any flat earther personally, but actually I found that there's plenty of anti-vaxxers among my friends. Some are non-friends anymore after COVID, of course, but the vaccine is a good example because it really affects you. It goes into your body, so you're very entitled to have concerns. And you can explain and show and prove and provide concrete evidence, numbers. And like if you could ideally speak to Fauci in person, you would find that the other person, the non-believer, may have some like rational counter argument, like I'm skeptical because of this, I'm skeptical because of that. But at the end of the day, even if, let's put it this way, they lost the rational argument. So they were, powerless in front of the amount of evidence you provide them, they would still say, nope, sorry, no, nope. I don't want to get vaccinated. You're not going to inject that thing inside my body. Like this, nope, is exactly the sentiment. Like, nope, 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 nope. And there, I don't know if it's emotional. I think it's even deeper than that, I think that the issue of trust runs really, really deep. And if someone is skeptical, but somehow it's open to have their mind changed, you can work with them, I guess. But those who are almost, who I'm talking about, the enthusiastic flat earthers,
yes,
the ones that really stand with that theory, those, now maybe I'm going to use a big word, but I believe that precisely because of where the issue lies, that's an antisocial behavior. Because it's not about the flat earth, it's about not wanting to rely on the knowledge supported by the most people, by the community, by the establishment, by the institutions. You could pick another topic, but I guess that the end goal of that human being as a person is to express, broadcast, manifest their distrust in those things, the systems and the groups. And it's an antisocial type of behavior.
There's a lot of great stuff that you touched on there. And as you were talking, I thought about some of my own experiences with some very similar conversations of people who are like, they believe in something wholeheartedly, even in the face of rational logic, of evidence I may put forth, of things that they cannot refute, they cannot say. Like, they look at it and they acknowledge, yes, that information they're giving me appears to be true, and yet they still will cling onto their belief like it's like their life depends on it. And there are a couple ideas that come to mind for me when I think about that. And when you bring up the flat earther who, like, they will continuously believe wholeheartedly that the earth is flat no matter what, I don't think it's an antisocial thing. I think it's actually the exact opposite. It is a social, very social thing, where, except instead of them, yes, it is anti-establishment, they're going against the grain, against everyone else, but they have their own group. Like, they want to shine within their own small group. They consider this group of flat earthers much more important, and they want to be seen as important in that area. And I see the same thing across a number of religions. I talk with religious people a lot, and some people who I've left the religion I was raised in. I've presented my evidence to my people. I'm not going to dig too deeply into that, but I see the same thing where the second I start bringing up things that are contrary to what they believe, they take it as an attack on them personally. Where you might see the same thing with perhaps presenting that kind of information to anti-vaxxers or flat earthers, where you present information that they deem dangerous to their belief, to their personal identity, and they'll instantly reject it, or they'll be start doing ad hominem attacks where they start insulting you personally, not attacking the argument instead. There's so much that we could dig into with that, but I want to push the science communication stuff to the side for a second and talk a bit about some of the other stuff that you do, specifically with technoculture and technology and what that looks like in the world today and into the future. So something that you've mentioned a few times before on your podcast, or I've heard a few times, is that, where is it? You say that technology should serve us and not that we should be serving technology. What do you mean by this?
Oh, do you need to ask me?
I don't, but I would love to hear it from you.
Right. Well, that can be answered at many levels, including the very abstract, almost political level. I normally mean it in the simplest way, which is just that the usability of my devices and my software should not cause me to have too steep a learning curve to figure out how the damn thing works, and should not make something more complicated than it would be to do by hand. Or it's bunch of good practices that fall under the umbrella of good design. Design is the keyword there, because these things don't exist in nature. We make them. You choose how many buttons to have on screen. You set the workflow. You set how the processing happens. Like, really, the sky is the limit. Creativity is really big in this field, but we keep narrowing down our choices to fixed protocols and pathways that force us to do things a certain way. Then most of the times, normal people, who are the less
the
tech
nebulous
savvy,
average person.
But absolutely, I mean, you always think of the grandpa, but it's not the case. Now it changes from country to country. The digital literacy changes from country to country, but there's plenty of adults in their 30s to 50s who still need those courses, like how to send an email, how to figure out some stuff on your phone, because those courses are everywhere and people follow them for the basic stuff. So, your average user that is now more often than not forced to use certain services online only, including for taxes or service, like for everything, I know, because I spoke to some people recently for doing many things, anything, everything has their own app or their own service, and you have to set up an account for each of these. Now, this doesn't really have to do with software design. The problem lies somewhere else, of course, in the multiplication of accounts we need to have. And then we are expected to have different passwords for each of these services. Who does that? I'm curious to know, right? But the fact that technology should serve us and not vice versa is kind of, of course, like a complex thing. But I have to boil it down. It's design. It's design.
Absolutely.
Very much. Yeah.
I'm reminded of there are certain design aspects of Facebook, of YouTube, of many social platforms where you can directly link some of those intentional designs that those companies made with casinos, with lotteries, with things that hijack the brain to make people want to stay on their app for longer. I definitely see that as like technology being made for people to serve it as opposed to the other way around. Sort of straying a little bit from that, in your mind, how has technology shaped what it means to be human?
Let me see if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah.
How does technology shape what it means to be human?
Yes.
All right. Well, that is the core question of my podcast, but I believe that it cannot be answered actually directly.
All right.
That's what it means to be human today. Or, those questions like, what difference does it really make in our lives as humans to go to a bookstore to buy a book or to order it on Amazon, to dump a boyfriend face to face or via text message? These are new behaviors allowed by these new technologies, and we all claim that they change the world we live in and our social interactions, and that there is a difference. It's different to do it the old way and to do it this way, but nobody can really measure that or really explain, actually. So I don't believe that the question how a certain technology changes this experience of being in the world at this time, I don't think that you can answer that question. Therefore, my podcast, talks around it. This is how I've always presented it. The underlying question is that we want to find out more about how digital technology changes our lives today. And technology becomes the lens through which to look at human experiences today. When we talk about the technology, that's always an excuse to kind of talk about the humans, the human experience, the users, the impact it has socially. I'm also very enthusiastic about the technology, but it's not a podcast that talks about the technology per se. There's plenty of those, and you can find those under the specific category, So my podcast talks around it. Every guest tackles the topic of technology, and for the most part, digital technology. And I believe that you can get a sense of what it means to be human today if you listen to all of the episodes, so to speak. Like, I have learned a great deal doing the podcast. I am probably the one that benefits the most from my podcast, as it should be, probably. It's my reward, because by editing the interviews, sometimes, so many times I went over the interviews that I knew them by heart. And I realized that I missed something the first time, the second time I listened, because some guests, man, they deliver some, complex ideas. And so it's by listening multiple times that I really interiorized some of the concepts. And I have to say that when I was more active, because admittedly, I'm not that active right now. I drop a new interview every blue moon. But there was a point where I was very active before COVID, and always, this is not a small point to me, always traveling to meet my guests and recording the interview in person. That increased my experience as a podcaster so much, because you get to see new things, to be where the guest is, and of course, you spend hours chatting before and after the recording. So it was very different than doing it on Zoom. And it's not to talk about myself, but back to the point, and then I'm done. See, I am the podcaster, and so I got to learn more from my own podcast than even the most loyal listeners can, because I know the episodes inside out, and on top of that, I spend time talking to the guests before and after the interviews. So the point, though, that I want to prove with my experience is that even if that question, what it means to be human today, cannot be answered directly, by talking around it so much, you do get a sense of what it means to be human today.
Absolutely. By studying and learning about different, perhaps not the core problem, perhaps think of it like a tree, where you have the core question of what does it mean to be human. Then we can study the branches a bit. We can see how does social media impact us? How does robotics impact us? How does cars, or how do all these different things impact us? They funnel into the main question, but they aren't really the main question. I think that, that sort of weird analogy that works.
I'll add to that, sorry to
Go for
jump in again. Quickly, I'll add that, first of all, do we even have the capacity for self-reflection? Because we have no historical distance at this point in time to see how technology is affecting us. And point number two, history in and of itself, it's an exercise in imagination. The best historians, I'm so passionate of history. I'm not trained in history, but I'm very passionate. And I found this idea, by the way, to be supported by some historians too, that the best historians are those who have the best capacity for this exercises in imagination, because they have all the data that other historians have. Those are the documents, the facts, the dates. But they could somehow, for some reason, talent, passion, resonate with the people of that era and come up with some sort of narrative or book or explanation of something that is not only resulting from the data. So there's still that human component of resonation in there. And my point with this actually is that even to explain to someone born today, young today, what it meant to live before the internet, it's quite impossible. You will never know. Fun fact, I have journaled since I was 14. And these days, I'm rereading, because I'm transcribing, a journal from 2002, when I was 21 years old and traveling. And traveling, of course, there was the internet. It existed. But I didn't have a mobile phone, etc. So I'm struggling to find youth hostels numbers. I have to call, I have to book. And I read it this morning. I say, I went to an internet cafe to check my emails. I sent a couple of messages, and I hope to read interesting replies in 2 days. Now you have it in your pocket, and you can scroll 15 times an hour if you're anxious. So even in the internet era, in the early days of that era, you still had to wait days sometimes to get an answer, because people had to go to internet cafes or, the slow connection, whatever. But even in the internet era, it wasn't like it is today. To explain to someone what it felt like to travel without a mobile phone in your pocket, which I have experienced, so I know, is impossible. So that's the point. To explain to someone, or even actually to put yourself in your old shoes, is difficult sometimes. So bottom line, radical statement, you can never explain to someone else how it is to live in a certain time and age if we look at this through the lens of technology. So how it was to, be around where not everybody had a car, and no television wasn't there. What kind of world was that, etc. I believe that you can never explain that. And that holds true even for stuff that we have experienced in our lives, people of a certain age. And therefore, it becomes ever more important to simply know how to talk around these things to get a sense of. So not to understand, but to get a sense of what it meant or what it means. My most recent interviews on the podcast are about the metaverse. So we speculate how it may be in the future, you see.
Speaking about the future, what do you think the world looks like in 5 years?
Oh, 5 years doesn't sound like a long time, right? But at the fast pace that things go. Yeah, good question. I rarely think about those things. I'm normally just, open-minded, meaning, who knows? I'm so curious to see, and I cannot wait to see, but I don't really have specific expectations. So this could be my answer. What am I going to tell you? More AI, for sure. But how it looks like, no, I don't know. No. I don't do that. Me personally. What a disappointing answer. No, I'm not into the future much.
That's totally fine. And I'm kind of in the same boat where I could make my best guesses. I could say, is there, AI is going to be better? Yes. Robotics is going to be better? Yes. We're going to get more, better technology? Probably. Maybe. Who knows? There could be something wild that happens that for some reason we take a step back in technology. I don't know what that would be, but it could happen, I guess. But I'm curious. Yeah. No matter what, just going to be curious about it. Just keeping an eye open. See what's going on.
I'm curious too, and I hope one thing. I hope it's not too painful to transition, because one thing is new technology, fine. Like maybe Zoom is new technology with respect to Skype. I don't know, because it is different and all you want. But okay, we could kind of do the same with that. So it's a new tool. It's better designed to specifically do video calls. Cool. So if we enhance this and transition to something else, cool. What is radically new? I don't know. Maybe self-driving cars that we actually see in the street, that we don't just know that they exist.
Not just in theory
But,
driving around the streets of San Francisco, California.
right.
Mm-hmm.
But if you need, Apple, listen to me, make money off a new phone, and you only change one tiny feature to be able to call it the new phone, fuck you. That is not new technology, and I don't want to pay for it, because unless you give me substantial improvement, I demand my right to keep using the, configuration of the buttons and the things that are already in my muscle memory, and that is so painful to change. So don't just move buttons around for the sake of it.
Yes, preach. I have my own bone to pick with Apple, but thank you. So, one of the questions I like to ask, since I'm very future forward looking, and something I like to try to provide my listeners on the show, is ideas and steps for what they can try to do next, or things they can focus on or try to learn. So, in your opinion, what are the skills you believe will be crucial to thriving today and into the future?
All right. So, the system wants you to be a certain way. And according to that system, in order to thrive, you will have to be into AI so much, and to know about marketing, business, promotion, communication. And in my view, I'm sorry, that would mean to bend over backward to fit the system, to become what the system wants, to thrive in this system. Critical and pessimistic view, maybe, but hey, that's my point when I say we shouldn't just teach programming to kids, but also who is the boss? Who wears the pants? Is it the machine or is it you? What are you going to program and how? So the other answer I have, which is the more idealistic, if you want, romantic, is that the most important skill you need to have to stay human is critical thinking. And with that, you will also be able to change the system and stay alive in it, kick and push back. And is that a skill? Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a meta skill, or it's a human competence. But, I think this is my twofold answer. Yeah.
I find that interesting because that's one of the few skills I have listed that I've preached across a number of different episodes where I say, if there's any skill that you should learn, critical thinking, for sure.
Yeah.
If you can think for yourself, if you can come to your own conclusions, amazing. There's something to that where you're not just, it comes back to that idea of trust. Can you trust the things around you? And if you can piece together your own information and you can think for yourself, that'll take you places.
I'll say this because in response to what you just said, I think I have like a new idea that I have never said before, whereas many things I've said during this conversation, I kind of have thought before or said before. Critical thinking doesn't mean that you necessarily will be able to discriminate this scientific study from this media article, from this and that. Critical thinking will necessarily make you distrust everything that begins when one study shows, or this study shows, which you should never believe. What do I mean by that? I mean that this critical thinking in our landscape may lead you to not believe most of the things you hear, but not because you lack the capacity to find out the truth. It's more because you realize that most things put out there and the way they're put out there are BS. Because the mainstream media actually loves to cover science, and not just the big breaks, but ongoing things like 2 eggs a week are good for you. A mug of coffee a day is not good for you. Those kinds of things. And these things are normally prefaced by a study shows. According to a recent study by, and if it's Harvard, it's better because it's more authoritative, so it counts more. But we have all read those articles. So 2 eggs a week are good for you. Now 3 eggs a week are bad for you. Is that science? Is science the problem? So if you apply critical thinking, you will find yourself like in a desert of information, because you will not believe what you read, but not because it's not even necessarily untrue. Maybe 2 eggs a week are good for you and that scientific study is solid. It's the landscape we live in. It's how we present the things that is not intelligent enough. So you will go, whoa, what does it mean one study shows? What study, where, and what about? So to have an intelligent conversation, I believe that requires a bit more time, a bit more context, a bit more healthy skepticism. Say, okay, what are we talking about here? And where do the problems actually lie? And what are the actual questions we're asking here?
Absolutely. Federica, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today. Where can people go to find more of you?
Well, I hope the link's in the description of this episode, because my name is pretty hard to spell. So I would say Google me, because I don't have one go-to website. Like I said, I have quite a presence online, although I don't have big numbers. I don't have thousands of followers, but I have my YouTube channel, my website for the podcast, website as an academic researcher, which of course is not now updated. I mean, it has not been updated in the past 2-3 years, but all my research is there with my CV, etc. And then a website for me as a science communicator. What else do I have? I have the novel I said. So I have the website for my book. God knows what else. All my social media, of course, mostly Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So plenty of ways to find me. Do reach out if you want. But either I would say Google or the links in the description of this episode.
Wonderful. Once again, thank you for coming on today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
My pleasure. I loved this conversation. Thank you so much.
All right. If you enjoyed this episode, then please share with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me, and it helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.